Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 161st episode of the Atlas Society Asks. I'm Lawrence Olivo, Associate Editor with the Atlas Society, the leading nonprofit teaching young people about the ideas of Ayn Rand in creative ways, such as through our Atlas University seminars, graphic novels, and creative social media content. Today, we are joined by two of our senior scholars, Dr. Stephen Hicks and Dr. Richard Salsman, who will be discussing several topics relating to current events in the news today. Some of the topics that we'll be trying to cover will be the debanking of controversial figures, along with the recent SCOTUS decision regarding affirmative action at Harvard University. We will also try to save some time near the end for audience questions, or we'll try to sprinkle in some questions during the conversation as well. So please, no matter what platform you're on, Zoom, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, put your questions in the comment section. We'll try to get to as many as we can. Now, to start things off, I'm going to pass things over to Stephen so we can talk about the debanking of controversial figures.
All right, thanks for that, Lawrence. I'm going to put up my PowerPoint. I just have one image on this topic. What I thought with your agreement, Richard, is I would introduce this topic. You say what thoughts you want, and then we go to audience participation and spend some time doing Q&A rather than saving everything for the end, and we'll just see how lively a topic this is.
I agree.
So,
good.
It sounds good to you?
Yeah, it's very good. Thanks, Steve.
All right. Slideshow from the beginning, just so this fills up and so on. So the context for this is a British piece of journalism that caught my attention and led me to think about it. It involved a well-known British politician, public intellectual named Nigel Farage. And what his particular political views are is not particularly relevant here. There's a more general point that he is a controversial figure. He's been on the front line of British politics and public intellectual discussion for any number of years. And so he's got strong admirers, but then also strong detractors and many outright haters. And what occurred was that his bank said that they were no longer going to allow him to bank there. So they basically shut down his accounts and in effect fired him as a customer. And this then led to a great deal of discussion about what implications this has for civil society, for the nature of our public discussions, and then particularly for people who are well-known public intellectuals, or of course celebrities of various sorts, if they can be, in this case, debanked. If banks then say, we're not going to allow you to have bank accounts here, obviously that puts the person's personal finances in disarray. So we have another variation on cancel culture. Cancel culture started inside the universities, rather than having a liberal ethos where we're going to have widespread debate and lots of different viewpoints out there, and guest speakers and professors from all over the ideological spectrum debating and talking about everything. A movement to deplatform or just not allow certain views and certain representatives of certain views to be part of the university. And so in this case, this is now that ethos spreading to banking. Now, what makes this an issue is that in Western culture first, now a couple of hundred years ago, with the rise of early modernism as we got into the Enlightenment, there was a huge push to get to a position of social tolerance with respect to all of the flashpoint issues that human beings always get worked up over. Of course, these are issues we should get worked up over: religion, politics, ethics, and so forth. But for many centuries, of course, Europe had a tradition of great intolerance. And it wasn't just political intolerance, it was social intolerance. You're of the wrong religion, right? You are coming from the wrong family. You are hold political views that I find anathema. Therefore, I am not going to engage with you socially. And of course, if I have any political influence, I will try to get you put in second or third class status politically. But it's this issue of social tolerance that Western Europeans first, And this says, as the Enlightenment spread, as Westernism became a more global ethos, a principle of tolerance with respect to most of the open to the public institutions. And so what happened over the course of the 17, 18, and on into the 1900s was the idea that when we are, say, lawyers, my first question is not going to be with respect to clients, what is this person's religion or what are their political views? If I am a physician, I will treat all patients, no matter what their religion, their politics, or where they come from in society. When we are doing business in the stock market, rather than saying, I'm only going to deal with other Baptists, or I'm not going to deal with Muslims. Instead, I will do business with anyone. And there's this very famous quotation that became the emblem for this from Voltaire. When Voltaire was in exile, he was in England, and checking out all things British and widely admiring of what the British had been able to accomplish. And for a Frenchman, he was especially struck when he visited the London Stock Exchange. And what he noticed there was that even though religious hatreds had been baked into European culture for centuries, and Reformation and Counter-Reformation war and all of the unpleasantness was still a live memory for everybody on the European continent. You notice at the London Stock Exchange, right, people who were dissenters would be doing business with Anglicans, and they would be doing business with Catholics, and doing business with Jews, and doing business with Muslims. And so the idea here was, we're going to, in effect, park religion at the door. This is an open, liberal space for doing business. And that should then be a model for, more broadly speaking, all of our professional spaces. So lawyers should be tolerant. Physicians should be socially tolerant. In business, we should be socially tolerant. We see this as professional sports became more prominent in the late 1800s on into the 1900s. Athletes, as part of their professionalism, but then also part of their ethos, they will participate in sports with members of other nationalities, other ethnic groups, other religions. They will set aside politics. At the end of the event, I will shake your hand, and so forth. So the idea then is we want to encourage this ethos of tolerance in all of the open to the public spaces where we're going to go about our business. And so what we then have is a signal transformation. Or this one act then seems important because everybody is connected in banking, and everybody needs to be able to do banking to function in the modern world. And so we have a fairly prominent British bank signaling that we're getting away from this universal tolerance. We are going to inject ideology into our banking decisions. And in effect, they're sending a signal to the market. We're only going to do business with people within a certain portion of the ideological spectrum. If you're not, you are out. Now, I want to say politically, I think the bank is perfectly within its rights to fire any customers it wants for any reason that it wants to do so. I'm not making a political point here. The question that's an interesting one is the scope of tolerance that we would like to have in our kind of non-political social institutions. So they politically have exactly the rights to do so, but is this a good thing to do socially? Now, at the same time, you want to say, fine, people have some range of where their tolerance is going to end. There are some people who are just so bad by your lights, mass murderers, pedophiles, terrorists, and so forth, that if you find you're doing business with those individuals, it's quite proper to dissociate from them. And in a free and open society, people should expect that different individuals are going to draw that line in different places. But this strikes me as not simply that, because Farage, in this case, is within the Overton window with respect to contemporary British culture and politics. And so whether individuals inside the bank should then make it a matter of banking policy with respect to other British citizens in this case that we're not going to do business with this sort of person. And of course, what then that is going to mean is that other banks will then, of course, respond by saying, well, then we will open our doors, especially to people of this ideological persuasion, and then we're back to different banks for different members of different political parties, different banks for different religions, and so forth. So drawing that line is an interesting question. Now, what I am focusing on, though, in this case is a political response to this very interesting question about social tolerance. So here we have a British politician whose response to the Farage Institute was this, incident was to introduce a law to say that what we will require of banks is that they not engage in this ideologically intolerant behavior. So banks are not allowed to discriminate on the basis of ideology. And so in this case, that bank, if it will probably be grandfathered in, but from the point, if this law gets passed going forward, banks would not be allowed to take a person's ideology into account. Now, this strikes me as a problem. I think the social drawing the line place is an interesting scope of tolerance question, but I think this is an inappropriate political interference with what is a cultural problem. Intolerance in this context is a cultural problem. Politics is about the use of force, and whenever possible, we do not want to try to solve cultural problems with political force. And the reasons for that are going to be, I think, rather obvious, right? One is that if we're going to make this a law, any law is going to require enforcement. And if the only way the laws can be enforced in this particular case is for politicians then to set up some sort of investigatory unit that makes it part of its business that anytime banks are saying yes or no to customers, saying yes or no to various kinds of deals, the government bureaucracy has the right, indeed the obligation, to make sure that no ideological considerations went into that. And that then means we're going to have much more robust political interference in banking decisions. So obviously the banking industry is already quite regulated and quite scrutinized, but it is going to be one more bureaucracy and one more level of scrutiny. And then the other thing that's the obvious point, I think, is that this then is just going to turn it into a political football, because what counts as appropriate or inappropriate ideological scrutiny, which ideologies are favored or not, are going to change in a democratic republic with each changing of the guard in a religion. And so banks then are going to have to be changing their policies, and they're going to be subject to different kinds of scrutinies and different kinds of bureaucratic decisions, depending on who the administration is in power. And I don't think we want to go down the road of turning banking even more into a political football than it already is. So I will pause there, having introduced what I take to be a very interesting issue about tolerance politically and socially.
Stephen, I just want to say briefly that I concur with your interpretation of this. We didn't talk ahead of time, and being in the same philosophic realm, I was predicting that we might come out this way. Yeah, I'm troubled by this as well. I think it's a very disturbing trend. The whole cancel culture thing is disturbing to the extent it's targeting decent people. But we've talked before about, I have never had a problem with targeting, isolating, denouncing, people of terrible views or terrible actions. And I think you're right that this falls into this category of the whole cancel culture. But the idea of mandating that certain institutions not do this is a real problem. And it does tend to be, I don't know if we can classify it this way, it does tend to be a conservative response to this. I think there's so many cases we saw with social media where alternatives developed. If you felt like you were being excluded from Facebook or Twitter or elsewhere, there are alternatives that are available, possibly way more today than ever before, including in banking. So I think that's another consideration. But even if the options were limited, we cannot go the route of the government mandating that private entities, be forced to deal with certain people. But I like your idea of we really need to get back to a kind of Lockean society of the tolerance, not only of religion, but of different views. But that has to be something by persuasion rather than mandate. Yeah, that's all I'll say about that. I don't know if you have any questions, Lauren.
So, and this, I have no problem with ahead of time. If a bank says, we want to be, I don't know, the Muslim American bank,
Right.
and we only want to deal with Muslim cultures, or we want to be the Greek American bank. We're only going to do Greek business and cultures with Greeks,
Right.
or
Right.
whatever. As long as your policies are clear,
Yeah.
and it's not a matter of intolerance, just that you want to have a market specialty,
Right.
and potential dealers know, well, if I don't fit that demographic, I'm just not going to see you as a prospective business partner. But if we have an institution that's already based on essentially a liberal tolerance ethos,
Yes.
and purely for ideological reasons, we want to undercut that entire ethos, I think that's a disturbing direction for a bank to go.
Another aspect of this is boycotts. I mean, boycotts have been around for centuries. I think that named after a British person actually named boycott. But the counter to that recently, which I thought was very clever, was boycotts. This happened with a company. The Goya Beans, who backed Trump, and then people criticized them, and then backers of Trump bought more Goya Beans than they ever bought before. So the counter to the boycott was the boycott. To support. So these kind of things go on. There's nothing wrong with that. The other thing I think of, Stephen, is that there are in the law public accommodations and public access mandates, at the lunch counter and stuff like that. But they're based on if you open up yourself to the public. Supreme Court ruled on this recently, actually, with a web designer who said, "Well, I will design websites, but I don't want to design websites for the LGBT community." And the left criticized that on the grounds that you're supposed to be open to everybody, even if it violates your principles. And the Supreme Court said, no, the web designer has a right to reject. And I think that was the right decision. But notice the category is never, you have a right to reject, based on the ideology of the customer. It's usually based on race and other things. So from the other side, there is another group saying you must serve customers, that tends to be the left. And so they have a inconsistent position as well. But at least it's limited to things like race and other seemingly non-essential aspects. I don't know what you think. What do you think of that? The public accommodations mandates. Would we get rid of those as well?
I think so. Yeah. I don't.
Yeah.
If you're going to be open to the public, you still have the right to say how open to the public and which sections of the public you're interested in being open to.
Right. You're not really open to.
I have no problem with colleges being open to the public, but we're going to be a women's only college or only college, right? Or I'm offering housing space, but only for people over 65 who are retirees, right? Or this is only for kids. So all of those age issues. As long as you're clear about what your principles are, go for it. Now, it might be that behind that, the person has an irrational or immoral reason for doing so.
Yes.
But that's something you will criticize morally, not politically.
Right. I totally agree. Yeah.
So do we spark any questions, Lawrence, I'm wondering, or comments from our participants?
Yes, we've gotten a good number of questions from Facebook and YouTube. So I've pulled a couple of them over. So we'll try to go through some now. Any that we don't get to now, we can always come back to closer to the end. The first one here comes from Wyatt516 on YouTube asking, aren't banks under some level of duress with DEI and ESG policies in deciding which customers are too extreme for them to be working with? Richard, you've done a whole talk about ESG in the past.
So the active verb there was duress. Does that just mean like social pressure, or does that mean political pressure, or something in the middle? That if you're going to get certification from some important board in your industry, you have to abide by certain regulations. I need a little more clarity on the duress part.
Well, hopefully I can provide that, but I think probably where that is just coming from, maybe duress isn't really the word, but it does seem that certain companies want to have that ESG rating or that higher score. This is something that we can see online on websites. Like if you get a higher score based on these ratings, it will help you when it comes to this stakeholders. They'll
Right.
they'll be more inclined
Yeah.
to support your company.
Right. So then I would say there's going to be just a two-front discussion that could and should be going on. One is going to be with respect to a bank, if we take the bank in this case here, if there is some sort of ESG rating agency, let's say it's not a government right now, and it wants to be able to, it would like to rather to have that ESG stamp on its resume, so to speak. Then it has to make a business decision about whether it is principled enough to say, we don't agree with that rating agency's principle, so we're going to fight back, or we're not committed to our principle, in this case, strong enough, we would rather have the ESG. So that would be an internal discussion for the bank to go on. And the other level of discussion is going to be inside the ESG certifying agency. Where is it going to draw its lines about, its particular Overton window, by which I mean how it defines the range of acceptable opinion. And if we are going to be in a liberal, open international culture, it should be a pretty wide window, and we should probably just reserve outside the window for clearly criminal and extreme cases of criminality.
Great. I will just sort of tack on why I did respond that he's referring to political and social pressure. This seems to be more in regards to what he's saying is we saw this happen with social media companies. Now, this might be more in reference to sort of the Twitter files where it sounded like government was sort of actively kind of pressuring social media to take certain actions. But I guess the question would be, are banks having that sort of pressure impressed on them? I don't know if there's been evidence to prove that.
Yeah, I don't know. I would be surprised if it's not happening, given the degree of oversight and regulation and behind closed doors conversations that go on between government officials and members of the banking industry. But just on general principles, political pressure of that sort, I think, is immoral and should be illegal.
I'd like to just make a quick observation that the clarity that Stephen brought to this, just right there, where he said, we're distinguishing between, is it moral? Should it be illegal? Is it political? Is it social? I think one of the great tragedies of what we call the mixed system that we have today, not pure liberty, not pure statism, but a mix, is it clouds these kind of issues. If we were able to do, as we're doing here, but it's not commonly endorsed, be able to say, well, this is a private institution, that's a public institution. Government should be forbidden to do this, but private institutions should be able to. When you say that to people, it strikes them the wrong way. They think, you mean private institutions might be discriminatory, exclusive, irrational, and effectively, although we advocate rationality, we're effectively saying, yes, people should be free to be irrational and let others boycott them, deal with them, not deal with them. And that rubs people the wrong way. But I think the main difficulty is people do blur these two realms. They don't think of these two realms as distinct as we do. I think of this often comes up in cases of public education. There'll be disputes over whether to teach evolution or intelligent design or some kind of religious conception. And the fights go on and on and on. And when you back up, you realize, well, these are philosophic fights, but they're also a fight because there's a singular curriculum mandated by the government. And if there were not public schools, then people would go their separate ways and develop different schools, and there wouldn't be a lot of fighting. So I just want to make this observation to back off a little bit, 30,000 feet and say, why are these disputes seemingly unresolvable? I think part of it is because we have a mixed system of freedom and controls.
Mm-hmm. And while, everyone dislikes the politicization of it, they're not, in many cases, willing to give up on the politicization for exactly the reason you were talking about in the banking, the discrimination case, right? The strong religious, intelligent design people then say, well, if we back away from the political fight, then that means in the so-called free market of education, evolution is going to have free reign, and people will get hot. And then the people who think evolution is scientific and creationism is ridiculous, well, that then means people are going to be free to indoctrinate their kids in creation. Right. So we have to be political about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, Stephen, also you mentioned that, if the culture just generally is in decline regarding toleration, I think another aspect of this is if it's true, postmodernism books suggest this, a decline in respect for just objectivity and persuasion and rationality and convincing generally, these kind of tactics, canceling, debanking, isolating, but strike me as more intimidative. It's like, I can't win the argument, therefore I'm going to starve you. I'm going to cut you off from your financing. You know what I mean? It strikes me as a more intimidating, although not strictly physicalist. It's not strictly, shackling people. But I don't know. What do you think about that? It's not really an argument.
Right. That's exactly right. To the extent postmodernism and other close intellectual movements have had an influence on education, and then on the more broad, it does mean a coarsening of the discourse. Because if you think, there is no such thing as truth and objectivity or rationality, then you're going to have a whole generation of people who don't try very hard to seek truth, to be objective, to be rational, and so forth. So they're not going to be as good at it, which means when we have contentious issues, they're going to then be more easily frustrated and more likely to resort to coarse and semi-physicalistic responses.
Yeah. The trend also in the corporate realm, I think it was in 2019, that the conference board, a major corporate board, said, we really are against the idea of exclusively pursuing profit and the maximization of shareholder value. So the whole stakeholder model, the idea that we should be serving things other than the owners, an array of special interest groups. So it's no longer the case that there are these two realms, namely ideological, academic, the intellectual versus the business world. The two have melded now, so that the CEO might well conclude, and the CEO suite might well conclude, well, if we exclude these people from our banking relationships, it may actually hurt us commercially. But that's okay, because that's not our main priority. So I think that's making it easier for these companies also to cave to pressure. I mean, companies have always caved to pressure, but I think they feel more warranted in caving because they've been told for years in law schools and business schools and elsewhere that money making and the bottom line, namely all we care about is the color of green, not any other issue. That's no longer the case. So they're prone now to these kind of pressures, and I think the critics know this. So the debank, you see what I'm saying? That's not starting.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're going to switch over to Richard's topic next, but I do want to get in this one last question, which, Stephen, you already kind of partially answered, but I thought I'd bring it up here. This is from Candace Morena on Facebook, who asks, how do you respond to people saying we cannot be tolerant of intolerance?
Yes, so that's a great question. And I think immediately one has to make a distinction between tolerance in a political way and tolerance in a social realm. Political tolerance, when that concept became important in the 1600s and on into the 1700s, particularly in our battles over religion, meant that we're no longer going to have religions trying to use the state to impose their religious views, or we're not going to have the state or the government using religion to try to get its political way. We're going to separate those two. And that then means that the government needs to be universally tolerant with respect to anything with respect to religion. That is to say, we're not going to use political force on those issues. And then that gets extended to commercial areas, to other walks of life as well. Now, social tolerance means that you are going to put up with, and part and parcel of having a liberal, kind of open, democratic, Republican society is people are going to have lots of freedoms. And when you give people lots of freedoms, they're going to believe all sorts of things, and they're going to adopt all sorts of lifestyle choices. And that means built into that sort of open society is a necessity that most people have a strong dose of tolerance. Otherwise, you are saying We're not going to have a society. I'm only going to deal with people who I exactly agree with on everything 100%. Everyone else I'm going to be adversarial with respect to, and that's just not going to function. So what I want to say is absolutely we should be intolerant of intolerance among our government officials. Their job is to be neutral with respect to any particular demographic or any particular view in society. But when it comes to tolerance and intolerance in society, we have to have a wide scope of tolerance, and that includes being tolerant of people who, as long as they are behaving on a social issue, are themselves intolerant. So if in a society there are people who say, I have my religion, I hate members of all other religions, and I'm only going to deal with my members of my religion, that's a very intolerant person. The rest of us nonetheless need to tolerate that person. That person is not using political means, in fact, is just isolating himself or herself from the rest of society. So yes, so there's going to be a lot of tolerance of the intolerant on social issues, but zero tolerance for intolerance among our government officials.
Okay, perfect. And now I see we're a little bit over the halfway mark now. So we're going to transition over to Richard's topic. Now, Richard, there's been a few things that have been shaken up now with the Supreme Court. There's still a tussle with, I know, student loans, but you specifically today wanted to talk about when it comes to affirmative action. So please take it away.
I did. Thank you very much. And the case here, which was decided, the ruling came down at the end of June, is Students for Fair Admissions. That's the group, that's the plaintiff, versus Harvard. There's a similar case versus UNC. The main difference being Harvard's a private institution and UNC is a public school. Also, Jackson, the most recent appointment to the bench, recused herself from the Harvard case because she went to Harvard. Now, that's the only reason they were split up, but basically the decision, which is against affirmative action in college admissions at these two schools. Now, and I don't know if that's narrow enough for you, but the way these things are written, the implication is this is a broader ruling against affirmative action generally. It's a complete reversal of precedent. So it's very, very important. And I think it's good news, but it's a mixed opinion. And I just want to tell you why it's mixed and why we should pay attention to it for the good and bad elements of it. But it's a 6-3 in the case of UNC, 6-3, and in the case of the Harvard 6-2 decision, mostly by conservative versus non-conservative. I hate to call them liberals, but on the side of rejecting admissions policy being race-based is Roberts and Thomas, Clarence Thomas, Alito, Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, and Barrett. The three against were Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson. Now, I just want to say this case began in 2014. That's how long it takes some of these to work their way through. And so that's what, 7 or 8 years. And hearing that, I thought, I wonder what the makeup of the Supreme Court was back in 2014. Of course, this is pre-Trump, and Trump got 3 nominees on the court, and 3 of these nominees just contributed to this decision. So the fact is, this decision would not have come down if it was decided in 2014, 15, or 16 before he got elected, which is itself kind of interesting. Elections have consequences. Presidential picks on the Supreme Court have consequences. The 3 that he put on the court voted in this way. So the vote would have gone 3-6 instead of 6-3 8 years ago. That's just as context. Now, here was the contention of the plaintiffs. And by the way, there were about 100 amicus briefs filed. Those are friends of the court briefs. 1/3 of them were for the plaintiffs, saying get rid of affirmative action in admissions. But interestingly, 2/3 of them were for keeping it as is. One of the main economists doing the field work and the data work on this was from Duke, who I know the professor, and interestingly on the other side, a professor from Berkeley looking at data. Now, what was the contention? The contention is largely that because Harvard tries to create a student mix which is not just grade-based or letter recommendation-based or extracurricular activity-based. Those are some of the criteria used in admissions, but race-based and what they call personality-based. The argument was if they mostly went on academic credentials, then there would be far more Asians accepted into Harvard and UNC and generally other schools than there are now. So the major claim was that Asians were being discriminated against. And this is interesting and different from prior cases, and I'll go through some prior cases on it, affirmative action in admissions policies, but all prior challenges were from white people. And so it was rejected on the grounds, in prior cases, partially rejected on the grounds that whites have nothing to complain about. I think there was actually some traction here and purchase because they were Asians complaining. Now, Harvard's response is we don't only go by scores, and we do want a diversity of students on campus, and that should be our prerogative. And race, they admit race is one of their considerations. So they would take in more, they admit, take in more Blacks and Latinos, all else equal, than they would Asians. But their view is that's only one of, 4 or 5 different criteria. The court basically said this violates, this procedure, having race anything to do with admissions, violates the 14th Amendment. So that's a constitutional violation, certainly something the Supreme Court should opine on. But also they cited Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Now, the 14th Amendment, if you look at it, doesn't actually refer to race. The 14th Amendment is one of the 3 post-Civil War amendments, and basically the 13th, 14th, and 15th. The 13th basically gets rid of slavery. The 14th says every citizen, every person, doesn't mention color, shall receive equal protection before the law. So you can't discriminate against anybody. And the 15th Amendment gives the right to vote, or basically says the right to vote cannot be prevented to, now this does mention color, based on color of the skin and race. That's in the 15th Amendment. That's not what's been cited here. It's the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment simply says, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the laws. So, and here's the language, by the way, of the 64 Act. No person, this is crucial to government funding, no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in or be denied the benefits of or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance, unquote. Now, if you, those of you not familiar with the 64 Civil Rights Act, it was basically passed because the South was still persisting in discrimination in voting and various other things, but it enshrined, unfortunately, affirmative action. It permitted a kind of conscious, even though this provision is in there, that's just for funding. If you get funding from the government, you can't use race. But it also has racial quotas kind of built into it and permits it. So the affirmative action has been on the table, so to speak, allowed, endorsed as a remedy. Now, to the extent it's restitution, it's an act of justice. If you could really prove that it was remedying past evils like slavery, maybe you can make a case for it. But the argument is you have current people being penalized for the sins of their ancestors, which is unjust. Now, this came up in 1970, just to give you context for this and what the Supreme Court has overthrown and why it's so huge. And I'll talk about the implications for other areas. In 1978, a medical school admissions application from a guy named Alan Bakke to the medical school at Berkeley was rejected, and he learned that it was on the grounds that he was white, that there were racial quotas. There were only 100 students taken in that year. And he found out that there were racial quotas requiring that somebody admitted be Black, and their scores were inferior to his. Now, he went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is known for this, not being very principled about it. They struck down the particular method used by Berkeley, but they did not strike down affirmative action generally. So they kind of split the baby on that. That was Justice Powell. Powell was a Nixon appointee. So there was the Powell court headed by a Republican nominee. That's what the decision was in Bakke, B-A-K-K-E. Now, fast forward, very interestingly, 2003, another major affirmative action case. And again, this is strictly having to do with college admissions. This time it was the University of Michigan Law School. And this time the majority opinion was by Sandra Day O'Connor. Sandra Day O'Connor was a Reagan appointee, so another Republican appointee in 2003. And a similar kind of deal was struck, that the particular technique used by Michigan was wrong, but affirmative action itself was still okay. So you see the precedent's rolling on, and it's moving on, and it's still there. But interestingly, Sandra Day O'Connor, in that opinion, said the following: "We expect that 25 years from now, the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary to further the interest in student body diversity that we've approved today," unquote. Isn't that interesting? Here she is kind of admitting this isn't really right. And I'm hoping we grow out of this, but we're not going to do it now. We either don't have enough support or we don't have enough context. So, 25 years after that would have been 2028. Here we are 5 years earlier than this. And lo and behold, it really has been struck down and out. Now, part of the problem, I think, here, and part of the defect in this is it's something Stephen and I were talking about in the prior segment. If technically in a free society, if a school wants to discriminate, even if it's an irrational form of discrimination, as I would consider race and other non-essentials to be, they are free to do so. But we don't have that system today. We have a mixed system today where the government feels the need either to condemn or not condemn these procedures and do the hair splitting. Even Roberts, in his majority opinion, said something like, well, it isn't as though race cannot be brought up in admissions, but it should be brought up in the essay written by the student, and the student should be, now he's telling the student how to write their admissions letter, which is crazy. That's right in the decision. But they should show how race has challenged them and has made them, fit to be a diverse citizen on campus. In many ways, this decision goes too far and kind of micromanages what the admissions policies and procedures should be. Nevertheless, I just want to let you know that this is how the decision came out. And as to the reaction of this, obviously Harvard and UNC objected, but they said they would follow the ruling. As to how they'll implement the ruling, letters went out to, 150 colleges from the winner, the legal firm and the special interest group that won this, pressing the case, reminding them they should change their policies. I don't think they're going to go the route of, having the admissions documents not mention your gender, your sex, your race. I mean, to the extent that's still on the admissions, I don't know if that will lead to that. So it's truly colorblind. But the dissent in Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, Jackson, Sotomayor, and Kagan, all of them said the colorblind approach is impossible. The court is going back on decades of social justice. You can imagine the kind of arguments they were using. I think it's ironic because, at least in the case of Sotomayor and Jackson, they were both basically the presidents that nominated them. The presidents named affirmative action as a reason to put them on the court. In the case of Sotomayor, a Latino woman. In the case of Jackson, a Black woman. This is not my interpretation or conspiracy theory about it. This is what these presidents said, I think, in the first case, Clinton, secondly, in the case, Biden. So my interpretation of this is I am glad to see this, especially in a context of the last few years where we've had CRT, critical race theory, arguing that America is systemically racist. Systemically meaning it's embedded in its institutions and laws and constitution. And I don't think that's true. So I think that's been a kind of smear on the American system. And I think the Supreme Court, in deciding this way, is basically saying, well, if there's any systemic racism, this certainly would be an example of it. What used to be called reverse racism, affirmative action. in Ayn Rand's famous essay on racism, which is in The Virtue of Selfishness, you might want to revisit this, written in 1964, around the time, and written because the Civil Rights Act was being proposed and the March on Washington occurred in 1963. She specifically addresses affirmative action. She doesn't call it affirmative action, but in the tail end of that essay, she's got some very interesting pages on what she calls racial quotas, which is effectively affirmative action. And, you can imagine her view, the consistent philosophic view: you do not fight racism with racism. And she specifically refers to the great virtue of being colorblind. And so it's a very nice passage, a very nice essay. I think I'll leave it at this. Perhaps the most interesting follow-up applications of this will be, will it go beyond Harvard and UNC? I think the argument is yes, it will go on to other colleges. Will it go beyond the universities into corporate and other institutions? Namely, can affirmative action programs in corporate hiring and corporate promotion in a whole bunch of other areas, not just corporate, but here we have the academic life, but what about the commercial life and other life? Is the Supreme Court going to use this? Is this strong enough and principled enough and broad-based enough to eventually apply across the board? I hope it does, but my main concern is that we're still mandating that private entities act in a certain way, and I'm uncomfortable with that. But that's just what we talked about the first segment, Stephen, right? I'll stop there.
Okay, well, that's perfect. I want to have just a couple of comments on this issue here. After the Supreme Court decision was announced, there was a major national survey done of Americans' attitudes with respect to race. And so all of this issue, right, you mentioned CRT about basically everybody is a racist and racism is baked into the system and the institutions and so on. I found this very encouraging. This question was put to, do you approve or disapprove of the Supreme Court's ruling on affirmative action? And it didn't matter what race, what gender, there was a majority of Americans who were in favor of the decision, in effect, arguing that the Supreme Court, in this case, its principles are in alignment with what's going on in the general culture. Even racial and ethnic minority groups, a majority of the members of those groups are opposed to race-based affirmative action. So in that sense, it's a sign of a healthy culture that, at least on the non-political elements, we're making good progress as well.
Stephen, before you leave that, notice the age breakout though. On the very top, I strongly approve. Yeah. The older people approve of it more than the younger people. Yeah. That is interesting.
Absolutely. Yep, that's right. And also level of education is going to be a factor there as well. Okay, so culturally, it's going to be an ongoing issue, but it seems like we're moving in the right direction. Now, this is the general population. One other thing I wanted to mention was that the New York Times published a long article in the wake of the Supreme Court decision, disagreeing with it significantly. And there was one very important, interesting feature about it. Someone went through and did a word count of how many times Asians were mentioned, how many times whites were mentioned, how many times Latinos were mentioned, how many times Black Americans were mentioned. And in the entire article, Asians were almost not mentioned at all. Wow. Whereas there were a dozen or more mentions of Latinos and even more mentions of Blacks and a few mentions of whites. So what's interesting is that even though this was a Supreme Court case, and the primary issue is whether this leading institution is discriminating against Asian Americans or not, the New York Times is not addressing that particular issue. Instead, it is pivoting to a discussion of Latinos or Hispanics, but then to a much greater degree, Black Americans. And then this, I think, is indicative of a certain mindset of what we, when we start thinking about left liberal progressive mindset, that, and this is where we have to start doing some interpretation here. If you're not addressing what is the central issue of the case, but focusing on something else, that something else is what's really on your mind. And what this indicates to me as one possible hypothesis is that for those who are in favor of affirmative action, they are not opposed to discrimination. Even though there's lots of against discrimination language, but they are fine with the discriminations if it is against whites. As you mentioned, the Bakke case, UC Davis versus Bakke, 1978. That was fine from this perspective. In the case of the University of Michigan Law School, that was a white plaintiff, so the discrimination was fine in that case. And in this case, Asians were clearly being discriminated against. Nobody argued that they were not. That is fine. So if it's not racial discrimination that is driving the thinking on those who are in favor of affirmative action, what is? And I think what we then have to say is that the affirmative action is intended to target groups that may or may not be racial groups, but are still at the low end of various social spectrum. And that we are fine with treating people as members of a group, not as individuals who are going to get in on their on according to their merit. So there is a collectivism that is driving this whole thing, but we are fine with sacrificing members of the stronger group if we think that's necessary to benefit the weaker group. And that is a textbook form of altruism. Sacrifice the stronger, the better off, those who have been successful. And from this perspective, whites and Asians have been very successful, so it's okay to sacrifice them if it is for the benefit of a perceived to be weaker group. So it strikes me that it's accidental in the thinking here, the racial issue, that what's really driving this is a kind of collectivism and a kind of altruism in the direction of just elevating any group that you think is not doing very well to a more equal status. That's the issue, and not so much racism.
I think that's an excellent point, Stephen. And the data on, you hate to group these people by race the way it's done, but the performance of the Asian population has just been fantastic. Higher income, higher education, real great work ethic, family coherence, all that kind of thing. And you're right, it's so that they are not, that doesn't fit the narrative of a group that seems to have been victimized. But certainly it's a race, and if America is systemically racist, why aren't they also racist against Asians? They seem not to be, so it goes unmentioned by the New York Times. That's a really good point, because the case was so distinctly about that group, and then not to mention that group kind of is a litmus test of what you're focusing on.
And there's also a kind of related issues that if it's about, you mentioned earlier, reparations or some sort of historical justice.
Yes.
The kind of amnesia at work here, because clearly Asians as a group have suffered all sorts of discrimination in American history.
Yes.
But none of that counts. That gets set aside. So for some reason, those who are in the so-called progressive category, there's a historical amnesia there, or dismissing of that history, but also they don't feel guilty about the discrimination with respect to Asians in a way they feel guilty with respect to other groups. And that asymmetry is also interesting. Why the guilt is one-sided and not more general.
There's a tangential aspect to this. I don't think it's a secondary issue, but I think it's still worth mentioning. This comes up a lot. It's worth noting. It is really quite an injustice to have this kind of system, to the extent when some favored privileged group does well, or someone in that group does well, there's a question in the general public as to whether they earned it or not. And that's always kind of hung over the head of anyone who is in these favored groups. So they achieve something on their own, but their achievement is somewhat clouded by the suspicion people have, wait a minute, did you get that job because of affirmative action? So I'm hoping that to the extent affirmative action fades away or moves away, there's less of that, at least. By the way, you mentioned reparations. I found in my research that some groups are starting to suspect that this might be applied to reparations movement and squelching it, by the way, squelching it, like preventing, because that's obviously picking up steam as well. But that these principles could be used to bar reparations, the reparations movement generally.
All right. Perfect. Thank you for that, Richard. Now we're coming down here to the last 4 minutes. I do want to try to get to at least one other question, maybe two if we have the time. This first one, Richard, this comes from Alex Morena on Facebook, who asks, what do you think Harvard's next steps will be? You kind of touched on this, but he asked, will they try to find another loophole to try to attempt affirmative action, or might President Biden try to push something through executive order like he's trying to do with student loans?
Yes, I think there are already steps being taken to sidestep this, to reword things, to do it in a different way. But it'll be difficult to do. But one response I noticed, I think this was in the law school, and not only at Harvard, I think it was done at Yale as well. Now get this, if you think, well, the way they got this data is they gathered SAT and LSAT scores and showed that the Asians did better. So what do you think Harvard's response would be? You don't have to submit test scores anymore. So it's just, it's a way to get around it so that, well, if the test score data aren't there, of course, that would make it, I think, even harder for Harvard to know who they're taking in. But if they go that route, and there was some suggestion that they'll go that route, to me, that just lowers standards further for the furtherance of this racist angle on their part. It's mind-boggling, but perhaps not surprising. Thoughts, Stephen? They seem to want to evade it without being illegal.
Yeah,
They're not going to lose funding over this, right? If they continue to have quotas, I doubt they would face the loss of funding. But have you seen any other responses other than this kind of resistance of?
No, we just know in general principles, universities have lots of clever people and they have lots of clever lawyers, so they will,
Right.
according to their ideological presuppositions, wherever they can to try multiple variations. Which is, it comes back to our constant refrain, which is that this really is a philosophical issue. Are we thinking of people as individuals? Do we believe in merit? Do we believe in achievement? Do we believe that there should be standards of colorblind justice and objectivity as possible? If we have a widespread culture of that, affirmative action will go away and we'll have a healthier culture for it. If not, we'll carry on the way we've been going.
I saw a couple of hysterical catastrophic reactions of, well, what will Black students do now? Okay, well, they might not go to Harvard, but that doesn't mean they don't go to college. Did you know, Stephen, we know part of the success in college is being in the right college, being in the right university. And meaning we want you to succeed. We don't want you to fail if we can prevent, if you do it on your own, that's one thing. But to put people in a position based on race or other non-academic, non-meritorious reasons sets them up for failure. So if a student's going to succeed at Indiana State and have a good career versus he goes to Harvard because Harvard's supposed to give him a bigger credential, but he does badly at Harvard. His grades are either bad or he flunks out. What good does it do him to have gotten into Harvard? So I don't know if that'll change.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we have officially hit the top of the hour, so this has been really interesting to hear you both talk. So thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you so much, Richard. I hope everyone who was watching this enjoyed the conversation as well. I know a lot of people had questions. We didn't get to all of them, but if you liked what we did today, we do these webinars every week with either our scholars or with interesting guests. And if you want to see more content like this, please let us know, or don't be a freeloader and help us with a tax-deductible donation. So next week, be sure to join us when the founding partner of Finance Technologies, Ed Dowd, will be joining our CEO, Jennifer Grossman, to talk about his latest book, Cause Unknown, The Epidemic of Sudden Deaths in 2021 and 2022. Again, Stephen, Richard, thank you so much for joining us, and everyone else.
Thanks, guys. They're good questions. Too bad we didn't get to more of them.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you, Stephen.
Maybe next time.